So what the parables are here are what you might call typical stories, in other words, stories of a type, which are designed to convey a lot of truth in a very compact delivery. The problem that most of us have with the parables in Luke here is the culture in which they are being spoken is fairly foreign to us. The first one we're going to do tonight will be the Good Samaritan. But as we go through it, there are things that the people who were listening to those parables would have understood without it having to be said. And an example I would use is if I were to say that Catherine went down to pick up some groceries. Everybody here knows that she's driving a car, or a van in her case. I don't have to say she got into her van and drove down to King Soopers to get some groceries. So that's sort of packed into the story and isn't stated. And if you don't understand the culture where these parables are being given, there's a whole lot of what's going on there that sort of goes over your head. So now what I want to do is go to Luke 10 and 25, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" One of the things that happens when Yeshua speaks anywhere is you get local authorities that will come in there and say, all right, just how much does this guy know? Yeshua, in this case, is in a group, and somebody there who regards himself as an authority asks Yeshua a question. And notice that the motivation there is to test him. Then we have a discussion on the Torah. Verse 26. He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, he the lawyer, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, Yeshua said, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." So you have this little Torah lesson, which is, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Love God, love your neighbor. Good answer. Go do that. Now, at this point, if the guy had walked off and put his hands in his pockets and loved God and loved his neighbor as best he could, he'd have been fine. But he can't leave well enough alone. But desiring to justify himself, he said to Yeshua, "Who is my neighbor?" I would gently suggest he's probably expecting an answer like the people in your community, perhaps the people in the synagogue, perhaps Israel. What he's not expecting is what he gets. Verse 30, Yeshua replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him." Pause there for a minute. A number of you I know have been on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. I am told, although I don't know this other than having been told it, that the Romans in fact had a garrison about halfway down because the place was so notorious for people getting robbed. It was a dangerous road. And as you go down there, you see these draws that go up, and the idea that could be somebody up there that would jump down on you is very believable. So the first thing to understand is everybody walking on that road knows who's in front of him and who's behind him. One of the things you would know is who else is out there. That's one of the things you pay attention to. The other thing to understand is at least the priest is riding a donkey. And this goes back to my example about Catherine and her minivan. The setup was that when priests did their turn in the temple, they would go up, get purified, do a 2-week stretch when they were on duty, and then turn around and go home, and home was very often Jericho. Lots of priests lived down in Jericho. Somebody in that class, a priest who was on duty, would not be walking. He would be riding. So the idea here is you have a priest riding on an animal as he goes down. Very possibly the Levite is too. Don't know that for sure. The next thing, and again you all know this, is that a priest, when he comes off duty, is in a state of ritual purity. He is tahar. It is forbidden for a priest to come in contact with a dead body. And the way Yeshua has set this up, a man was going down to Jerusalem, to Jericho, and fell among robbers who stripped him, beat him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And I will suggest, as genealogy, he's also laying face down. One of the things that you'll notice in the Middle East, and it's the same way in the United States or any place else, certain groups wear certain kinds of clothing. And you can walk through a high school and you can tell who the Goths are. You can tell who the jocks are. By their dress, you can tell who they are. And it's the same thing in Israel. Everybody would have been able to tell who anybody else was to some degree of specificity by what they wore. So the fact that this guy has been stripped and he's at best down to his skivvies, maybe not even that, you can't tell where he's from looking at him. And of course, I added face down, and we can also assert that you can't tell him whether he's circumcised or not. Furthermore, he's unconscious, so you can't tell by his accent where he's from. So we can't look at his clothes and tell who he is. We can't hear him talk and know who he is. And as I say, I've added on it that he's lying face down, so we can't even tell if he's circumcised. So what Yeshua has set up here is a generic human being. All you know is that this is the image of God. He is a human being. You know nothing else. You don't know whether he's dead or alive. So the first guy going by on his donkey is the priest, and the priest has got an incentive not to find out. Because if the guy is dead or dies in the process, he will become unclean and will have to get purified. Now, what I have just given you is the standard take on this. Let's step outside of the standard take for a minute. As I understand rabbinic law, a high priest is required to defile himself in order to take care of a corpse that nobody else is taking care of. So the standard answer that, gee, he doesn't want to become unclean is shaky in that sense, because if a priest does come upon an unattended body, his duty is to take care of the thing that used to be the image of God, even if it means becoming defiled. Now, having said that, I also led this off by suggesting that everybody knows who's on the road. So it may well be the case that the priest knows that there are people coming along behind him who can do something, and so he can justify himself. I'm putting thoughts in his head, and I don't know. Certainly when the Levite comes by, the Levite would probably have known that the priest went before him. And so if the priest didn't stop, that could be taken as permission for him not to stop. If you are walking down the street and you start to have a heart attack and you keel over on the pavement, it is very likely that if the first person who sees you passes by, everybody else will too. Because the first person that passes you by gives everybody else permission to ignore you. And what they suggest that you do is you're walking down the street and you feel a heart attack coming on, you look over and say, "You in the red shirt, heart attack, call 911. Boom. And now you have a relationship. You are no longer just a body laying on the ground. You are now somebody who's made contact, and this guy now has a reason not to pass you by. The idea that when one guy passes by, in this case the priest, other people then have implicit permission to pass by is very human. So now what everybody is expecting at this point is a priest, a Levite, and of course the next one in the pecking order is an Israelite. That's how they're expecting the story to go. So when Yeshua throws a Samaritan in there, it's like slapping him in the face. Because the Samaritans are yet another sect of Judaism that the people listening to Yeshua would not have had anything to do with. When the Assyrians sanded off the northern kingdom, the way the Assyrians did things is they moved, captured people out of their territory so they wouldn't have any connection to their land, and this is Dad's farm. It's been, and so to discourage rebellion, they separated the people from the land they grew up on, moved whole populations and planted them somewhere else. That way they're off balance, they're not in the place they grew up, and it's harder for them to rebel. When the Assyrians took the northern kingdom and took them away, that left a void. So what the Assyrians did is moved somebody else in there. And the people that they moved in looked around and said, so who are the local gods here? How do we worship this God? How do you get along here? And they took up Torah. But the native Hebrews never accepted them as being Jews. So the idea of a Samaritan showing up as the hero of this story is a real disconnect. 33. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of it. I said at the beginning the priest was riding an animal. What does the Samaritan do? Puts him on an animal, binds him up, and puts oil and wine on his wounds. Basically does everything necessary to care for this guy. And the next day he took 2 denarii, and of course everybody here knows that a denarius is a day's wage for a common laborer. A skilled laborer would get more. If you're a skilled mason or a carpenter or something like that has a skill, you would be worth more than that. We're talking about common laborers. So he gives him 2 denarii, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Yeshua said to him, you go and do likewise. The idea that a Samaritan is more righteous and more compassionate than a priest or a Levite is sort of by way of sticking it into them. That's not anything that they would have expected. Notice that what the Samaritan does is backs out what happened with the robbers. Several things are going on with the Samaritan. He doesn't know if this guy is a decoy. You've all seen the scenario where somebody gets a flat tire, quote unquote, and standing out there waving, and then somebody pulls up to help with a flat, and people come out and jump them and rob them. So the idea here is this guy could be a decoy, and you could have the robbers up in the mountain waiting for somebody to stop and help him, and then jump on whoever stops and helps him. The second thing is, remember we said we have no idea who this guy is. All we know is he's a generic human being. Now, put yourself back in the old Hopalong Cassidy days, or Wyatt Earp, or whatever cowboy guy you like, and the stock Hollywood treatment of cowboys and Indians. What happens if an Indian rides into town with a white man draped over his horse and says, I found this guy in the desert? Certainly there's a risk there that the townspeople will say, yeah, sure, and the Indian may in fact be in trouble. Well, the road between Jerusalem and Jericho is Jewish territory. For a Samaritan to pick up a random guy laying on the ground and carry him to the nearest town where, gee, look at this guy I found, and all the people say, wait a minute, that's Uncle Mortimer. What do you mean you found him, you filthy Samaritan? So there's some risk to the Samaritan beyond just the possibility that he's going to get ambushed. He certainly could get ambushed by the robbers, but he's also in potential danger from this guy's family or tribe or town, whoever he is. Because we don't know who he is. They all look alike. All of them dark-skinned, dark hair. It's not like even like cowboys and Indians, where you got potentially blonde cowboys and dark Indians. Don't know who this guy is. The question is, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Two parts to the answer. Love your neighbor, love God. And what Yeshua has done by this story is, without preaching at this guy, he has suddenly opened up his understanding of who is his neighbor. And again, that's the beauty of a parable, is because you can pack a whole lot of information. I could have read this thing in a minute, but I've been talking about it now for half an hour because there's that much stuff in it. And that's the power of a story.